Hitler's rise and fall, the Führer's final days in the bunker, the fall of a dying empire. In the final days of the Second World War, as smoke chokes the skies above a crumbling Berlin, the once unstoppable German war machine groans under the weight of its own monstrous ambition. The echoes of triumph have long since faded, replaced by the distant thunder of Soviet artillery inching ever closer to the heart of the Reich. Deep beneath the earth, in a bunker cold with dread and stale air, a man who once commanded nations cowers in silence. Adolf Hitler, the architect of ruin, now a prisoner of his own delusions. The streets above, once filled with parades and propaganda, lie in ruin, their people ravaged by war and betrayal. Those who once shouted with pride now whisper in fear, knowing the retribution they face is inevitable. Many had tried to end him, plots woven in secret by the brave and the desperate, but each failed, reinforcing Hitler's belief that some divine hand shielded him from fate. Yet now, even he cannot deny the truth. The end is near. Around him, loyalists like A.A. Brown refuse to abandon his side, clinging to a hopeless loyalty while the empire crumbles. This was his war, his vision, his madness, and he will not let it go. He drags his nation with him into the abyss, still believing in the illusion that cost millions their lives and left Germany in ashes. The rise of the Führer, illusion, fire, and control. In the shadows of a broken post-war Germany, where humiliation still lingered from the Treaty of Versailles and economic despair gnawed at the soul of a nation, a figure emerged, magnetic, commanding, and relentless. Adolf Hitler did not seize power in a flash of revolution, but rather wove his way into the very fabric of the nation's weakened democracy, seducing the people with promises of rebirth and vengeance. On the 30th of January 1933, he was appointed chancellor, not as an absolute ruler, but as a leader within a fragile coalition government in which only 3 positions belonged to the Nazi Party. At this early stage, his control was far from secure. The reins of power slipped through his fingers just as often as he gripped them. Yet beneath his theatrical speeches and populist charm lay a calculated opportunist, one who understood how to manipulate fear and chaos to his advantage. It was not brute force, but cunning that paved his path to total authority. The Reichstag fire, a devastating blaze that consumed the German parliament building, offered him the perfect stage. Though its origins remain cloaked in mystery, its outcome was unmistakable. Hitler cast blame swiftly, branding it a communist conspiracy and using the fear it generated to push through emergency decrees that stripped away civil liberties. The Enabling Act followed, granting him the power to pass laws without parliamentary consent, effectively dismantling democratic barriers. In the blink of a historical eye, Germany was transformed into a one-party state. The political left was first to fall. Socialists and communists outlawed, their voices silenced, their leaders imprisoned or worse. With rivals eliminated and opposition crushed, Hitler secured a monopoly on political life. Though the presidency remained a separate role, the death of President Paul von Hindenburg gave Hitler the opportunity he had long awaited. With no rivals strong enough to stop him, he merged the offices of Chancellor and President into a singular title of his own making, Führer, the Supreme Leader. This was more than a title. It was a transformation of state power into personal power, the formal birth of a fascist regime. Beneath the banner of the swastika, law, propaganda, and myth coalesced into an unrelenting mechanism of control. He weaponized nationalism, victimhood and spectacle, casting himself not only as Germany's leader, but as its savior, divinely chosen to restore its destiny. Through radio, cinema, and orchestrated rallies, he mesmerized a disillusioned population and turned Germany into a stage for his ideology. Every move was carefully choreographed, every event seized and reframed, as if history itself bowed to his will. Yet the foundations of this power were built not on strength, but on manipulation, fear, and repression. What began as an appointment within a fractured democracy rapidly devolved into a cult of personality that rewrote the rules of governance and reshaped the destiny of a continent. Hitler's rise was not inevitable, but it was methodical, and it was devastating. The illusion of choice and the machinery of fear. It began not with force, but with illusion. An illusion so skillfully crafted that millions believed they were shaping their destiny, when in truth, they were walking willingly into the grip of tyranny. Hitler did not seize control of Germany overnight. He made the people believe they had chosen him. Through ballots cast under growing pressure and fear, he could claim legitimacy even as he hollowed out the very meaning of democracy. Soon, the truth emerged with brutal clarity. All political opposition was outlawed, and the Nazi Party stood alone. What was once a republic had become a totalitarian state where the Führer's word became law, and the people were told, "This was your will." But this was no mere dictatorship. It was a calculated deception, one rooted in Hitler's obsessive belief in his divine purpose and racial destiny. He envisioned a society purified of all who did not fit his warped ideal of the Aryan race. Under the guise of national rebirth, horrifying programs were set into motion: forced sterilizations, eugenics laws, and social engineering that violated human dignity. As ideology tightened its grip, so too did surveillance and terror. A new kind of power took root, not just in uniforms and parades, but in whispers and suspicion. The Gestapo, Hitler's secret state police, was created not to fight crime, but to instill fear. These plain-clothed officers, invisible and omnipresent, built networks of informants in every apartment block, every neighborhood, turning neighbors into spies and fear into the most effective form of control. Germany became a nation where silence was survival, where trust dissolved, and where terror was institutionalized. It was a new order built not only on obedience, but on fear that seeped into the cracks of daily life, turning the ordinary into instruments of tyranny. 3. The road to expansion, power beyond borders. In the autumn of 1933, as the leaves of diplomacy began to fall, Hitler took a decisive step that would shift the balance of global peace. He withdrew Germany from the League of Nations. It was not simply a rejection of international cooperation. It was the opening act of a much darker ambition. Cloaked in rhetoric of sovereignty and strength, Hitler's decision was rooted in his unshakable belief in power over principle and force over dialogue. The League, born from the ruins of the First World War to preserve peace and mediate disputes, stood as a symbol of collective restraint. But restraint was the very thing Hitler despised. He envisioned a new Germany, reborn through militarism, conquest, and the erasure of imposed shame. By rejecting the League, he liberated himself from the moral and legal boundaries set by the Treaty of Versailles, freeing the path for rearmament and territorial aggression. His ideology, drawn from Mein Kampf, demanded living space, Lebensraum, and so he set his eyes on the lands he claimed were unjustly separated from the German spirit. The Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, with its ethnic Germans, became the first target, a test of Europe's willingness to resist. Austria, with its shared language and cultural ties, was next, absorbed under the guise of unification. And to the east, Poland loomed, a land ripe for invasion under the pretense of reclaiming history. Hitler masked these ambitions as destiny, as justice, and the German people, still bearing the scars of economic collapse and national humiliation, believed in the illusion. They did not yet see the storm ahead, nor the abyss into which they were being led. What they saw was strength returned, pride rekindled, unaware that this path, paved by applause, would end in terror. The storm breaks. The illusion shatters in Poland. As dawn broke on September 1st, 1939, the world awakened to a nightmare it had hoped never to see again. Without formal warning and cloaked in the lies of fabricated provocations, Hitler launched a ruthless assault on Poland, a calculated move that shattered the thin veil of peace Europe had desperately clung to. This was not just an invasion, it was the ignition of a global firestorm. For the first time, foreign leaders began to understand the terrifying scope of Hitler's madness, the breadth of his ambition, and the depth of his contempt for human life. This was not war in the traditional sense. It was blitzkrieg, lightning war, a ferocious and overwhelming military strategy designed to annihilate resistance with speed, shock, and terror. The German army struck with mechanical precision, moving with devastating force through Polish defenses, while from the east, Stalin's Soviet troops advanced under the shadow of a secret pact, carving the country in two. Yet the world remembers Hitler's aggression, the cold, deliberate advance of Nazi forces into a sovereign nation, backed by propaganda and a chilling doctrine of racial extermination. Within days, Britain declared war on Germany, but the cost came too late for Poland. In just over a month, the country lay in ruins, its cities shattered, its people crushed beneath the boots of oppression. Tens of thousands were executed without trial, and over 2 million Polish Jews now found themselves trapped under the Nazi regime, their fate darkened by a future of ghettos, camps, and death. Hitler had declared this a war of racial annihilation. Mercy was forbidden, and cruelty was systemized. And though the scars of the First World War still haunted Germany, and the fear of trench warfare lingered, Hitler's popularity and hypnotic grip ensured compliance. Many did not cheer, but they followed. The machine had been set in motion, and no voice could stop it now. Europe trembled and the world watched as the darkness spread with terrifying speed. The descent into darkness, the path to the final solution. From the earliest pages of Mein Kampf, Adolf Hitler had already revealed the venom at the core of his vision, a deep, personal, and obsessive hatred of the Jewish people. It was more than prejudice. It was ideology weaponized. When the Third Reich came to power, Hitler transformed that hatred into a machinery of law and terror. What began as hateful rhetoric soon became official policy. Jews in Germany were swiftly branded as internal enemies, and across the country, new laws tore away their citizenship, stripped them of basic rights, and reduced them to second-class status. Their exclusion was not only legal, but social, banned from schools, professions, and even public pools, under the grotesque claim that their presence contaminated German purity. It was humiliation by design, cruelty masked as order. All the while, within Germany's borders, an illusion of pride and power was cultivated. Propaganda painted the picture of a restored nation, victorious, united, and destined. Hitler understood the psychology of admiration. He was obsessed with public opinion and determined to be adored. Using photography, film, and rallies, he fashioned himself as a savior, an infallible visionary rising from Germany's defeat to forge a new empire. And while the people looked upward at the image of greatness below the surface, Hitler's most horrifying ambitions took root. As war consumed Europe and German eyes turned outward toward battlefields and patriotic slogans, Nazi anti-Semitic policy escalated. Hitler's inner circle, committed to what they called the Jewish problem, began enforcing increasingly brutal measures, transitioning from exclusion to extermination. At first, Jews were forced into ghettos, crowded, disease-ridden quarters cut off from the rest of society. From there, they were deported to concentration camps where they were starved, tortured, and worked to death. These were not accidents of war, but deliberate acts of policy. There was no formal written order bearing Hitler's signature commanding the annihilation of European Jewry, yet his intentions echoed in every directive, every speech behind closed doors. He was careful, calculating, and understood that genocide must be concealed beneath the fog of euphemism. By the summer of 1941, following the invasion of the Soviet Union, Nazi plans took a decisive and irreversible turn toward mass murder. Operation Reinhard was launched, and extermination camps were constructed, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, engineered solely to kill. These were not labor camps masquerading as prisons. They were death machines. Victims arrived and, within minutes, were dead. There was no pretense, no hope. Entire families were swallowed by gas chambers hidden behind walls and barbed wire. Hitler's regime now enacted what would be known as the final solution, a cold, bureaucratic term to mask the planned destruction of an entire people. The Wannsee Conference of January 1942 formalized the operation, a gathering of Nazi officials who mapped the logistics of extermination. 6 camps were built on Polish soil to ensure the genocide occurred out of sight, away from the German public, who by then were distracted by their own war hardships and conditioned not to ask questions. These camps, Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Majdanek, Sobibor, Chełmno, and Belzec, became the epicenters of human horror. They were not only places of death, but symbols of mechanized cruelty on a scale the world had never seen. Auschwitz, the most infamous of all, was a sprawling complex with a dual function: forced labor and extermination. Over 1 million Jews were murdered there, many gassed upon arrival. The camp stretched across 3 main sites, its scale astonishing and its cruelty unimaginable. Treblinka, in contrast, was brutally efficient, no more than the size of a football pitch, yet it claimed the lives of approximately 850,000 people. Victims were transported from across occupied Europe, France, the Netherlands, Hungary, Greece, packed into cattle cars, promised relocation, and met, instead, with death. These human beings, robbed of identity and dignity, became numbers in a system designed to erase them from history. The Germans who lived near these places often claimed ignorance, and perhaps for many, the illusion was complete. The camps were hidden in forests, shrouded in secrecy, guarded not only by soldiers, but by the apathy and distraction of a nation at war. The final solution was not only a plan of extermination, it was a plan of disappearance. Jews did not only die, they vanished from thought, removed from public sight, erased from memory until the war's end revealed the extent of the atrocities. By then, 6 million Jews had been murdered, their lives stolen in gas chambers through starvation, disease, bullets, and forced labor. This was the result of one man's pathological vision for a racially pure empire realized by a state apparatus that turned neighbors into enemies and bureaucrats into executioners. The Holocaust was not only the greatest crime of Hitler's regime, it was the defining horror of the 20th century. And in the silence of those who did not speak, and the machinery that ran with chilling precision, we are left with a warning that echoes louder than any victory or defeat. The fall of the West and the Skyward gamble. By 1940, Adolf Hitler stood at the peak of his power, his army sweeping across Europe with a terrifying mix of speed and precision. One by one, nations fell: Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, all collapsing under the weight of the German blitzkrieg, a military doctrine that struck with the force and speed of lightning. But it was the fall of France that sealed Hitler's image as an unstoppable force. When Nazi troops marched triumphantly into Paris, the world watched in stunned silence as one of Europe's greatest powers was reduced to a conquered prize. This was a moment that fed the myth of Hitler's invincibility, a high point in his reign of terror, where admiration and fear merged in the eyes of the German people. Yet across the narrow strip of sea, the English Channel, stood the United Kingdom, the next coveted jewel in Hitler's imperial dream. But unlike those on the continent, Britain refused to yield. The Battle of Britain began not with tanks, but with wings. Hitler unleashed the full fury of the Luftwaffe, believing air dominance would break British resistance swiftly. But he had gravely underestimated his enemy. When the Royal Air Force bombed Berlin on August 25, 1940, it inflicted little physical damage, but it struck deep into Nazi pride, shaking Hitler's certainty. In a rage, he redirected his assault from military airfields to civilian cities, hoping to break morale through terror. Yet this decision proved costly. While cities burned, the RAF rebuilt, regrouped, and retaliated. The Nazis lost the edge before they even knew they had it, and the skies above Britain marked the first true halt to Hitler's war machine. 7. Operation Barbarossa, a fatal obsession. As Hitler stood triumphant over a subdued Western Europe, a shift began to stir within his mind. Not one born of strategy, but of obsession. The drums of victory in Paris and Brussels were still echoing when he made a chilling decision that would alter the trajectory of the war, to turn his gaze eastward toward the vast frozen expanse of the Soviet Union. Despite the non-aggression pact signed with Stalin in August 1939, a calculated move meant to buy time and ease the path to Poland. Hitler had always viewed Bolshevism as a disease to be eradicated, a poison infecting the world. The pact had served its purpose, but now Hitler, intoxicated by power and driven by hatred, was ready to cast it aside. On June 22, 1941, the illusion of alliance shattered as Operation Barbarossa was launched, the largest land invasion in history. Millions of German troops surged across the Eastern Front, striking with terrifying speed and cruelty. The orders were clear. This was to be a war of annihilation. There was no room for mercy. Soviet prisoners were to be starved, civilians slaughtered, and entire populations displaced in the name of racial and ideological conquest. At first, it seemed the blitzkrieg strategy had worked again. German forces sliced through Soviet territory with frightening ease, overwhelming the Red Army, catching Stalin off guard, and pressing deep into the heart of Russia. But this time, the enemy was not easily subdued. The vastness of the land, the resilience of the people, and the harshness of the environment began to push back. By October, the brutal Russian winter set in, relentless, unforgiving, and unyielding. Machinery froze, supply lines crumbled, and soldiers began to die not only from battle, but from cold and hunger. Hitler had promised victory within 6 months, but reality told a darker tale. The longer the campaign dragged on, the more it drained Germany's strength and morale. Even Goebbels' propaganda machine, once capable of painting disaster as triumph, could no longer hide the truth. Casualties mounted, spirits withered, and what was meant to be a swift conquest turned into a quagmire of blood and frost. The Eastern Front had become a graveyard for Hitler's ambitions, and among his inner circle and his people, whispers of doubt began to rise. The awakening of a giant, a war transformed. As Hitler's forces battled fiercely on the Eastern Front, a distant storm was brewing, one that would soon engulf the war in ways even the Führer had not foreseen. On December 7, 1941, the Empire of Japan launched a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, unleashing chaos and death upon thousands of U.S. servicemen. In a single day, the slumbering giant of the United States was jolted awake. The next morning, President Franklin D. Roosevelt stood before Congress and declared war on Japan. But this declaration was not limited to the Pacific. With Japan, Germany, and Italy bound by the Tripartite Pact, Hitler was now compelled to act. Just 4 days later, in a move that defied logic and caution, Hitler declared war on America. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. In striking at the United States, Hitler had invited into the war a nation of unparalleled industrial strength, a country capable of producing weapons, aircraft, tanks, and manpower on a scale unmatched by any other power. The entry of America into the conflict reshaped the balance of global warfare. The Allied powers, Britain battered but unyielding, the Soviet Union hardened by the brutality of the Eastern Front, and now America rising with righteous fury, formed a coalition unlike any the world had ever seen. This was not merely an alliance of convenience, but a fusion of resources, strategy, and sheer determination. Hitler had once believed that fear and speed would secure him victory, but now he faced a united front with limitless resolve. The tide was turning. The man who had once seemed invincible had, through his own arrogance and underestimation, awakened a force that would ultimately lead to his downfall. So, the final collapse, madness, betrayal, and the end of the Reich. As the bitter winter deepened on the Russian front, and the failure at Moscow shattered Hitler's illusion of invincibility, the atmosphere within the Nazi command began to shift from triumph to desperation. Orders to hold positions at all costs, issued by Hitler himself, began to alienate even his most loyal generals. Yet the Führer refused to face defeat, retreat, or reality. Meanwhile, Winston Churchill moved quickly to build a strategic alliance with Joseph Stalin, and together they forged a plan to pressure Hitler from all sides, starting with a decisive campaign in North Africa, followed by an assault on Italy, and, eventually, a landing in France. Stalin agreed to hold the Eastern Front through winter, while the Western Allies gathered strength. However, the Eastern Front itself was already descending into one of the most savage battles in human history, the Battle of Stalingrad. On August 23, 1942, the Luftwaffe rained bombs upon the city, killing thousands and reducing it to rubble. In September, Germany's Sixth Army advanced into the ruins to claim what seemed a final Soviet defeat. But the Soviet defense, though fractured, refused to collapse. As brutal street fighting wore on and the Russian winter set in, the tide turned. Fog, snow, and bitter cold crippled the German advance, isolating and exhausting the invaders. With the Luftwaffe unable to maintain supply lines, Soviet forces encircled the city and trapped the German army. Hitler, blinded by pride, demanded they fight to the last man. On January 8, 1943, the Soviets offered surrender terms, which Hitler rejected. His refusal condemned thousands to die of frostbite, disease, and starvation. When surrender finally came on February 2nd, it marked the fall of the mighty Sixth Army. Only 90,000 survivors remained out of over 220,000 troops. It was the greatest defeat the Nazis had yet endured, shattering morale and shaking the German public's faith. As dissent grew and resistance began to take root even within the Nazi ranks, Hitler's psychological state deteriorated. The man who once commanded with iron confidence now became a ghost of himself, retreating into an underground bunker beneath the Reich chancellery in Berlin. On January 16, 1945, Hitler relocated permanently into this concrete tomb 28 feet below ground, surrounded by loyalists and propaganda ministers like Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann. The bunker, damp and claustrophobic, was filled with stolen art and fine furnishings in a futile attempt to preserve the illusion of power. Yet the world above was collapsing. As Soviet forces closed in, resistance within Germany intensified. The once untouchable dictator now hid from his own people, communicating through guarded conference rooms and heavily filtered reports. Life in the bunker became surreal. Goebbels maintained the propaganda. Eva Braun danced and drank to mask despair, and Hitler issued increasingly irrational military orders disconnected from reality. By April 1945, the Red Army had broken into Berlin itself. The city burned, its streets turned to rubble, while within the bunker, Hitler descended further into madness. On April 20th, his final public appearance, he emerged briefly to award medals to teenage members of the Hitler Youth before returning to the shadows. As the Soviet pushed to within meters of the Reich chancellery, Hitler refused to face defeat. He screamed at his generals, issued doomed counteroffensives, and clung to delusions of salvation. His once commanding voice no longer inspired. It trembled with paranoia and fear. With Germany's fate sealed, Hitler began to consider suicide, consulting doctors on how to die quickly and surely. He decided to use a cyanide capsule combined with a gunshot to the head. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the Allies had long known the end was near. Since November 1943, bombings had intensified. Berlin's great monuments were turned to ash, and Goebbels' desperate propaganda no longer inspired belief. Hitler had once claimed he would lead Germany to eternal glory, but now he blamed the German people for failing him, declaring they no longer deserved survival. By June 1944, the Allies were closing in from all sides. D-Day brought the Western Front crashing back into Europe, while the Soviets pushed through Eastern Europe toward Germany. The Nazi regime, beset on all fronts, had become a crumbling shell of its former terror. The realization that Hitler was no longer leading, but simply hiding, gave rise to one of the most serious internal plots against his life. On July 20th, 1944, Operation Valkyrie unfolded. A bold attempt by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg and other high-ranking officers to assassinate Hitler and seize control. A bomb was placed in a briefcase during a meeting in the wolf's lair. The explosion destroyed the room, but by a cruel twist of fate, Hitler survived, shielded by the heavy oak table and escaping with minor injuries. The failure of this attempt dealt a devastating blow to internal resistance. Mass arrests, executions, and purges followed. Yet the attack revealed what was increasingly obvious. Even those once loyal now recognized Hitler's catastrophic leadership. Still, the war dragged on. Every missed chance for surrender, every failed coup meant more death, more suffering, more devastation. Hitler, increasingly detached from reality, continued to make absurd demands from his bunker, even as the walls of Berlin caved in under Soviet fire. By April 1945, the city was reduced to ashes. Hitler's dream of a 1,000-year Reich had become a nightmare of concrete and shadows. Eva Braun, kept hidden for years to preserve Hitler's public image, now remained faithfully by his side. Together, they hosted strange, morbid parties in the bunker, dancing and drinking, while death crept closer. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler took his own life, fulfilling the only promise he had left, to escape justice. Eva Braun followed him in suicide. Their bodies were burned in the bunker courtyard, and within days, Berlin had fallen. With his death, the regime collapsed. But the scars left by Hitler's war, his lies, his hatred, his manipulation, remained etched into the conscience of the world. What began as a charismatic rise to power ended in madness and ruin, a chilling reminder of how fear, obedience, and unchecked ambition can lead entire nations into darkness. 10. Twilight of the Reich, Berlin in ruins. As the first half of 1945 unfolded, Germany descended into its darkest hours, a nation ravaged by fire, fear, and retribution. The war that Hitler had unleashed upon the world was now devouring his empire from all sides. From the east, the Red Army advanced with unstoppable fury, driven not just by military purpose, but by vengeance, fueled by memories of the horrors committed by Nazi forces on Soviet soil. From the west, the Americans and British pushed forward with equal determination, their goal clear: to end the nightmare once and for all. It was the Soviets who reached Berlin first, and what they found was not a capital, but a corpse of a city, broken, burning, and drowning in chaos. Streets once filled with propaganda and parades were now ruled by terror, as loyal Nazi patrols hunted down any citizen unwilling to fight, hanging those who dared to surrender. Others took their own lives rather than face the horrors that crept ever closer. The city became a theater of despair, its buildings crumbling, its people shattered. Soviet troops, brutalized by years of war, answered cruelty with cruelty, pillaging and assaulting as they moved through the ruins. Within this apocalypse, Hitler's illusion of omnipotence was unraveling. His body trembled uncontrollably, his voice lost its fire, and the myth of the invincible Führer dissolved beneath the weight of reality. The once mighty Third Reich was no more than a bunker-bound fantasy. With every shell that fell on Berlin, beginning symbolically on Hitler's birthday, April 20th, the end grew nearer. Goebbels' empty slogans still clung to walls, urging resistance, but few believed. Civilians waved white flags, or simply collapsed under despair, many choosing suicide over surrender. The dream of a 1,000-year Reich had turned to dust, and in its final days, the dictator who had once held Europe in his grip was now buried beneath it, clinging to delusion as the world he built crumbled above him. 11. The final descent, the death of the dictator. As April 1945 drew to a close, the world above was collapsing in fire, steel, and chaos, while below, in the dark concrete bowels of Berlin, the final days of Adolf Hitler unraveled with slow inevitability. On April 27th, the Soviet encirclement of Berlin was complete, and Russian troops were pushing deeper into the city, inching ever closer to the government district. The Third Reich, once thunderous in its ambition, was now a shattered skeleton, and within the Führer bunker, madness and betrayal festered among the last remnants of Hitler's inner circle. On April 28th, news arrived that struck at the heart of Hitler's paranoia. Heinrich Himmler, once one of his most trusted allies and chief architect of the regime's darkest policies, had secretly attempted to negotiate peace with the Western Allies. To Hitler, this was the ultimate act of treason. Enraged and humiliated, he ordered Himmler's arrest, but Himmler had already disappeared. In his place, Hitler summoned Hermann Fegelein, Himmler's liaison and brother-in-law, to Eva Braun, only to find him absent from the bunker. Traced to his apartment, drunk and preparing to flee in civilian clothes, Fegelein was dragged back, sentenced to death, and executed. As betrayal spread and allies turned to cowards, the news of Benito Mussolini's brutal execution by partisans in Italy reached the bunker. The image of Mussolini's mutilated body hanging in public filled Hitler with dread. He swore he would not allow himself to meet the same end. From that moment, he began to finalize plans for his own death and the destruction of his body to avoid posthumous desecration. Amid the psychological collapse, Hitler dictated his last will and political testament to his secretary, Traudl Junge. It was a delusional document filled with self-justification and denial. He expressed gratitude to the German people, insisted he had never desired war, and called for the struggle to continue, even in his absence. But the illusion of control was slipping. On April 29th, he made a final symbolic gesture. He married Eva Braun, the woman who had remained hidden from public view for years, a companion molded into his vision of a perfect, subservient partner. Their relationship, never fully understood, had always seemed more performative than passionate. She represented everything Hitler admired in women: loyalty, obedience, and silence. Their marriage, witnessed by the last faithful remnants of the Nazi elite, was less a celebration than a farewell, a grim ritual before death. Even as Eva Braun attempted to inject moments of joy into their final hours with music and wine, the weight of what was to come silenced any festivity. The bunker was saturated in resignation. The once commanding Führer was now a hollow, trembling figure held together by injections and delusions, a man crushed by the war he created. On the afternoon of April 30th, 1945, Hitler emerged for the final time from his quarters to greet his aides. In silence, he shook hands with those who remained. Without speeches or sentiment, he turned away and disappeared behind the heavy door of his private room. There, with Eva Braun by his side, he delivered to her a cyanide capsule, and with his pistol in hand, they sat together and faced their final moment. A single gunshot echoed through the concrete corridors. Those outside knew instantly Adolf Hitler was dead. His guards entered the room, wrapped the corpses, and carried them up the emergency exit to the smoldering remains of the Reich Chancellery garden. There, they doused the bodies in petrol and set them alight. Flames consumed the remains of a man who had once set the world on fire, reducing his legacy to ash in a shallow crater carved by Allied bombs. Around him, others in the bunker followed suit, suicides cascading through the final hours as those who had built a regime of terror chose death over capture. Goebbels and his wife murdered their 6 children before killing themselves. The bunker became a mausoleum of fanaticism. Little was left of Hitler in the end. Some scorched remains, a few bone fragments, and a jawbone later matched with his dental records now held in Moscow's archives. His body gone, his empire dissolved. Hitler's final act closed a chapter of history written in fear, destruction, and death. The dream of a 1,000-year Reich ended not in glory, but in a bunker, beneath rubble, among the delusions of a dictator who could not accept defeat. 12. The Reckoning. Truth unearthed and a nation confronted. Just days after the death of Adolf Hitler, the Third Reich crumbled into ash and silence. On May 7, 1945, Germany officially surrendered to the Allies, and with that act, the world exhaled. But the breath was short-lived, for what followed shook the very conscience of humanity. As Allied forces spread through the former Nazi territories, they uncovered a horror so profound, so systematic, and so inhuman that it defied belief. The gates of the death camps were opened, not to prisoners seeking escape, but to liberators who stood frozen in disbelief at the scale of suffering within. Skeletons in striped uniforms, piles of bodies, gas chambers still scented with death. These were not battlefield casualties. They were victims of ideology, murdered by a regime that called itself righteous. The full truth of the Holocaust and Nazi atrocities emerged into daylight, and the myth of Hitler as a visionary leader collapsed beneath the weight of exposed evil. Those who had once cheered him now faced the unbearable truth of what had been done in their name. Germany, stunned by the enormity of its collective past, entered a long and painful process of reckoning. The Allied occupation initiated 3 crucial pillars of post-war transformation: demilitarization, denazification, and re-education. The goal was not only to rebuild Germany, but to unmake the very foundation of the regime that had nearly destroyed the world. At the heart of this process were the Nuremberg trials, where the surviving high-ranking Nazi officials, those who had not taken their own lives, stood before an international tribunal. For the first time in modern history, individuals were held legally accountable for crimes against humanity. Their testimonies and the evidence presented revealed the intricate machinery of genocide, oppression, and war. These proceedings became a mirror for Germany and the world, a brutal reflection of what happens when hatred and absolute power go unchallenged. For generations of Germans, the challenge of confronting this legacy became central to national identity. Schools taught the Holocaust, museums were built on former campgrounds, and public discourse refused to forget. The burden of remembrance became both a responsibility and a form of national healing. Still, questions remained. Had the people been deceived by criminals, or had they surrendered their morality to an ideology out of fear or convenience? The answer lies not in one judgment, but in the commitment to never repeat such darkness. After the war, the physical remnants of the Nazi era were systematically erased. The chancellery buildings were razed by the Soviets between 1945 and 1949 in an effort to destroy the symbols of the dictatorship. The Führer bunker itself, though partially flooded and damaged in failed demolition attempts in 1947, stubbornly remained beneath the surface. To prevent it from becoming a shrine for neo-Nazi sentiment, East German authorities buried it under layers of concrete and constructed anonymous housing above it. The area was left deliberately nondescript, a silent testament to a past that could never be celebrated, only remembered. Today, there are no statues, no monuments at the site. only memory, heavy and unyielding. This was the fall of a man who believed himself immortal, the collapse of a regime that promised glory and delivered genocide. It is a story not only of war, but of what humanity must never allow again. If this story moved you, if you believe in the importance of remembering history so it is never repeated, we invite you to like, share, and follow for more. Let the truth echo and never be silenced again.